Okay, so this is our program for the week of March 21st, 2025. I want to at some point bring up Samar early on so that we can get started on all that we need to cover for this week. We've reiterated numerous times on this program how much the rise of authoritarianism is entwined in U.S. imperial policy. Last night we hosted a PSA, not a PSA, but a political ed event on in the second part of our series on hostile takeover, looking a little bit more at ideologies and end games among the tech oligarchs. And so frequently in these conversations on the PSAs, we've talked about authoritarianism and US imperial policy and the entwinement of those two things exemplified by this tenuous alliance among Christian nationalists, Zionists, and neo-reactionary oligarchs. And Trump's second presidency is blurring and sharpening those contradictions all at once and also clarifying class allegiances in some consequential ways. And there's something that I saw this morning that broke yesterday. I think we talked a little bit about this executive order and the kind of strange executive orders that have been coming out of the Trump administration. There was one targeting the law firm of Paul Weiss for having one of their former partners be involved heavily in one of the Trump prosecutions, namely the one in Manhattan. Um, and it turns out that after meeting with the head of Paul Weiss this week, so just a week after I think that order was issued, the that Paul Weiss has essentially capitulated to Trump in a fairly dangerous way, not only agreeing to get rid of their DEI programs, but also to provide $40 million in pro bono services to support Trump's initiatives. Including, and I think this is Samar where I want to bring you up in terms of providing support to quote combat to support the president's task force to combat anti-Semitism. So, there's probably a lot we're going to cover that carries on with some of the storylines that you have been helping us track around what's happening within higher education, Columbia, the kind of repression that's happening on campus, these targeted deportations, not only Mahmoud Khalil's, but there's a researcher, I believe, in Georgetown, and you mentioned another one to me that happened somewhere else in the country this week that I hope you'll talk about. But what we're seeing is, that this fascist project is really being flanked by Zionist forces that ostensibly, maybe previously, may have found themselves in a different sort of alignment, but are either aligning themselves for part of this authoritarian project and repression, or at least, capitulating quite easily under the pressure that the administration is applying either via threats to their funding or, in some sort of collaboration with the right-wing forces to try to bankrupt organizations and defund institutions and entities. So I'm wondering, as we talk a little bit about what you're going to cover this week, what you think about all this, where you think we're headed. Those are bigger questions, but maybe any response you have to some of this news.
Yeah, it's been a real fire hose this week. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot there to unpack, I think, and we'll get into some of the details about the Trump's new anti-Semitism order and its like blatant hypocrisy, like almost Orwellian level of sort of like eating its own logic. But I think I'm trying to hold these two very disparate thoughts as they relate to all the repression that we've seen in the past week. One is obviously the existential threat, right, to our movement and Palestine solidarity work generally, and the broader progressive left, right? Obviously, this doesn't stop with Palestine; it only starts with Palestine. And we're seeing the brazen willingness, just looking at the deportations of those Venezuelans this week, right, and the total unwillingness to follow court orders, the absence of the need to like justify any actions, or provide any evidence. We're seeing the same sort of Mahmoud Khalid playbooks expand outward. And again, that's something we'll get into in more detail. But I think the one thing that gives me a little bit of solace and like the other piece that I hold while holding all of this sort of fear and need for defense is, these are actions taken from a position of weakness,
Yeah.
right? Like an effectively capable hegemonic power doesn't need to exercise this level of like tin pot repression. And the fact that, they have to resort to these like, regime style like terror tactics, I think speaks to the fear, right? That it speaks to their existential threat that this movement, this idea, particularly of Zionists in this country, claiming to speak for the American Jewish population, claiming to speak, as this sort of like liberal, we defend the only democracy kind of vibe. Like that's all mask off now, right? Like they're so happy to be expelling and suspending Jewish students. They're very happy to ally with Trump on all of these like wild executive orders. So at the bare minimum, we know the enemy that we're facing now, and they seem very desperate. So I do take some strength from that, I guess.
Yeah, and I think this was made a point. I mean, I think Annie will drop a link into the chat to last night's program, which is up on our YouTube. But this is one of the points that I think Matthew Lyons made really well, which is that all of this type of, and I like your terminology there, tin pot repression is a clear sign of weakness, and also I think it's a sign of how much this project still remains entwined in Trump's very frail ego. And he's not obviously not the only one. Musk and a lot of the other tech oligarchs also in the words of Steve Bannon, actually, 11-year-old boys with some real issues. And so I think you're right that there's a lot for us to think about in terms of this is these are signs of weakness, especially this kind of, the kind of the pretexts here, which are, to your point about the Venezuelan immigrants who've been picked up and sent to El Salvador. The pretexts there were very superficial, tattoos. Sometimes it's unclear exactly what the justifications were. And so that is something for us to think about as we're looking at the totality of what we're facing in this moment, even if it does feel like we're getting hit from all sides, that this is in fact very much at the outset a project that is entwined in Trump's ego and his fragility, and also a sign of weakness for the entire kind of regime as it's rightly characterized in this moment.
Mhm.
With that, happy to cede the floor to you, and thanks again, Sammer, for being here. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to talk to us about.
Thanks, Thomas. And yeah, failing of the Trump regime and weakness of the entire neoliberal order, which is collapsing all around us. So, we'll take our wins where we can get them. And it's nice to hold on to those things because this week feels heavy and really hard, I think, and I'm sure a lot of the folks listening in today are feeling that too. Like, oh, these are not the updates I wanted to give this week. Um, and yeah, it's been a real struggle like going through all this and putting it all together because we're back, in a place we really, really, really didn't want to be in, which is the collapse, the full collapse of the remainder, whatever vestiges remained of the ceasefire agreement. And this is something, we talked about last week, like this idea that Israel had been ramping up its pressure tactics to force a concession into, like breaking the original deal that was signed in January and to switch to, basically an endless continuation of phase one. And we said the only lever they had left was like the return to violence. And here, sure enough, we're back to like full scale genocide. Uh, these last few days have been among the deadliest in the history of this assault on Gaza. With as of yesterday, over 700 dead um, in a series of really horrific bombings that have actually been timed specifically around maximizing civilian casualties, right? So they're carried out in the middle of the night where, like they're just blowing up apartment buildings where families are sleeping. By all accounts, at least two-thirds of the people who have been killed in this recent set of bombings and attacks are women and children. It's probably more than that. And again, that sort of seems to be the point. And, despite claims, obviously, from the Israeli military that these are attacks, targeted at Hamas leaders. They did kill some high-level government officials, no one affiliated with the military that I'm aware of, but like, like the like governance officials inside Gaza. and in so doing, also, hundreds and hundreds of civilians. Um, it's been accompanied by, the sort of typical bellicose rhetoric that we've come to expect from Israel, where Netanyahu is basically saying this is just the beginning, and threatening that that these will escalate, and that attacks where they are right now represent the sort of floor of what Israel is going to be doing. And he used the phrase negotiations from now on will only take place under fire, right? Basically being like, okay, if Hamas doesn't agree to basically full capitulation, we're just going to kill more and more people. They just the framing and context of just like pure terroristic horror. And here we are. And sure enough, not only did we find out that the United States had known in advance that Israel was going to break the ceasefire and resume the assault on Gaza, but for his part, the Trump administration has issued similarly like nightmarish rhetoric around all hell breaking loose in Gaza, and everyone who seeks to terrorize Israel will pay a price. The sort of like cartoon villain language. What one part of this that I wanted to pull out that was included in this Al Jazeera article that I definitely recommend folks give a read is not only was the Trump administration made aware of the assaults happening, not only did the Trump administration respond basically saying like, yes, like great, inflict maximum damage, but it goes into a lot of detail about Ron Dermer, who's the Minister of Strategic Affairs, the former Israeli ambassador, and his negotiations with Trump officials, telling them, well ahead of the ceasefire falling apart, that Israel had no interest in phase two of the ceasefire agreement. And that, in his words, Israel is not committed to the three-stage plan. And even if it had previously signed it, it's not committed to implementing it. And instead, the plan was, and the plan that had been communicated to Hamas was, all the remaining hostages had to be released in one big single stage, and in exchange for Palestinian prisoners, and that's it. And if that demand wasn't met, that there would be a quote return to intense warfare. So that's exactly what happened. Basically, Israel violated the deal. They knew that they were going to violate the deal. They communicated to the United States that they had no interest in maintaining it, and that they were holding the deal hostage, basically, like, unless you agree to this changed dynamic, we're just going to start bombing people again. And that's exactly what happened. And of course, it started with airstrikes, but now we're seeing the full ground incursions, the recapture of the Netzarim corridor, so-called, that cuts Gaza in half. As far as I know, they've taken Salah ad-Din Road, which is like the main vehicle pathway that connects the north and the south, but they have not yet, at least as when I checked it a couple of days ago, they had not yet taken Rashid, which is the coastal road, the one that has those famous pictures of the tens of thousands of Palestinians walking back to their homes in the north. But it seems inevitable, if they haven't taken it yet, that they will soon. Uh, they have announced that large-scale evacuations are coming. So I think we can expect a depopulation of the north again. And I honestly can't even imagine the horror and heartbreak of these families that have risked so much and given so much to finally return to their homes, to be forced out of their homes again. Um, and I think, yeah, we should expect to see that in the coming days, I think, along with, with the cutting off of humanitarian aid and the cutting off of electricity and the sealing of the borders. These large scale migrations are going to be, horrifically deadly. It's hard to imagine them being anything less than, another trail of tears. Um, Alongside that, the defense minister, Israel Katz, is saying that unless Hamas agrees to the new dynamic soon, that Israel will, quote unquote, deepen its buffer zones, basically meaning that it will annex more territory of Gaza, and like raise more buildings in all the areas that along the border of the Gaza Strip. So, just also a threat to steal land if people don't do what they say. It's good, at least, that there seems to be a really broad understanding that Israel is responsible for the ceasefire falling apart. I mean, it's just objectively the case. You're seeing not only in Israeli media, but also in US media, finally, some like direct acknowledgement that Israel broke the truce. And this editorial in Haaretz, I think, does a really good job of actually getting into the idea that Israel's 100% responsible for all of this falling apart. And even goes into this idea uh, that the Israeli government said that Hamas's repeated refusal to release our hostages, as well as rejection of the proposals represented, is a lie. It's a blatant lie because it was Israel that violated the agreement and never started negotiations for phase two, and basically tried to derail and change the agreement midstream. And it's I feel like worth noting. Basically, the way that this article opens is saying that um, Netanyahu like brought back in Itamar Ben-Gvir, the hard right minister who had sort of threatened to resign over the signing of the ceasefire, and he brought him back in by paying his asking price, not out of his own pocket, but with the blood of the 60 remaining Israeli hostages that are in Gaza, whose like fates are sealed by the resumption of the attacks, right? So I think it puts it very starkly, and I think it shows the feeling even within Israel that Netanyahu is basically, blatantly using this war for his own naked political ambitions in a way that like doesn't really align with um, the strategic interests of the country, or obviously like the desire to end the violence and or to bring the political prisoners home. Um, the change in rhetoric around this in the United States in particular, I think is quite remarkable and something that we really need to capitalize on as we're seeing a sort of mood shift around the acceptability of what Israel is doing. This article in MSNBC, this like opinion piece, I think I found to be fascinating, not only because it was written by a fellow at Defense Priorities, which is a Koch brothers funded think tank, just to give you a sense of where the ideological leanings here are, that basically just goes into the idea that the ceasefire was never really real. The Israelis had no interest in implementing it, and that it will require the United States to pressure the Israelis to get it back. And they say in this article, the killing has resumed and it will continue until one of three things happens. Either Trump puts the screws on Netanyahu like he did in January to get the ceasefire signed then, or the ceasefire and hostage release talks resume, or Hamas just capitulates. And they immediately say the last scenario is virtually unthinkable, so Hamas is not going to capitulate. And the second scenario of resuming ceasefire talks isn't going to happen unless Trump pressures Israel to do it because they have no real interest in a ceasefire. And so, is it possible that Trump will actually do this, given that he seems to be fine with everything the Israelis are doing now? And basically, that they land on the idea that, like, okay, well, he seems fine with what Israel is doing, but Netanyahu has been a major thorn in his side because Trump has these grand ambitions for this like new peace plan in the Middle East generally, and a new nuclear deal with Iran and normalization with Saudi Arabia, and Israel's refusal to sort of end the carnage in Gaza is tanking all of those plans. So it's not inconceivable that his relationship with Netanyahu will sour, given how like unpredictable and fickle Trump can be about all of this stuff. On the table right now is this so-called bridge proposal from the United States, where 5 Israeli political prisoners would be exchanged for Palestinian prisoners. One of them is the remaining surviving dual citizen U.S. Israeli political prisoner, something Katz, I think. I'm not sure about that. Anyway, that deal is apparently still under negotiation. Hamas is saying that they're continuing to negotiate, and the representatives are in Qatar negotiating even as the violence is resuming. And they are steadfastly refusing to accept the sort of like indefinite phase one version of the ceasefire agreements that Israel is trying to push. So there seems to be absolutely no willingness on the part of the Hamas negotiators to sort of go along with um, this attempt to basically uh, massacre enough people to force Hamas to the table, which, you know, for folks who have been coming to these PSAs for a while, has been the Israeli playbook for a year and a half and has never worked. It has literally never worked. There's no reason to think it's suddenly going to start to work. And yet, you know, this is where we find ourselves again and again, you know, like people in Gaza pay the price for these like absurd strategies. One piece underlying the resumption of, you know, full-scale genocide, like the hot war, this week, is that it happened to coincide with Netanyahu's uh, corruption trial, where he was meant to give testimony for his own corruption trial, which has now been indefinitely postponed because it happened the same day as the like Gaza offensive. So it seems clear that like that was at least part of the considerations here, where you know he's currently facing three distinct corruption charges, each of which is pretty massive, and the evidence is quite overwhelming. But in a very like you know Trumpian fashion, or maybe Trump is acting in a Netanyahu-y fashion. Uh, you know, there's this sort of like anger at the so-called deep state and the left who are trying to in Netanyahu's words, thwart the people's will. And you can see like Elon Musk agreeing with Bibi. You know, they're all one little cabal. Um, that has like the postponement of the corruption trial and like the firing of some high level Israeli officials and the sudden, you know, realization within Israel that the remaining hostages will not, in fact, be released anytime soon has led to massive protests inside the country, basically calling for an end to the war in Gaza and a resumption of negotiations, which is a huge shift in popular opinion from, you know, the Israelis have generally been very, very in favor of this war for a very long time. And they still don't seem to be protesting because of the, you know, 100,000 Palestinians that have been killed, but whatever gets them there, I guess, like there's still pressure happening inside Israel for something here to change. So that's not nothing, and I think worth digging into a little bit. Um, but you know, at the end of the day, as is the case here, right? Netanyahu isn't really accountable to, you know, like the general citizenry. So, you know, those protests have to sort of push beyond uh, just like being out on the street and affect the underlying like political and material conditions that are underlying Netanyahu's decision to resume hostilities in Gaza, which might be possible. And we'll sort of loop back around on that, I think, by the end of this. Meanwhile, the displacement plan, the like full ethnic cleansing plan of Gaza is still in effect. You know, the US and Israel are both trying to find ways to make this happen. Over the weekend, last week, it came out that the US administration had been talking to Sudan, Somalia, and Somaliland about taking in Palestinians en masse. Sudan issued a statement more or less immediately saying, under no circumstances would we ever do this. And I think both Somalia and Somaliland said, we have no idea what you're talking about, which, you know, you can interpret different ways. But um, the added to that list now is a new article. I didn't put the screenshot in here, but the URL is in the slides that the Israel is now looking at Syria as a potential dumping ground for the Palestinians it's aiming to displace. Again, it doesn't seem very likely, but with you know Syria's moves, with Israel's moves on Syria's southern border, it's not inconceivable. Um, Although it may be overplaying a bit, and we'll also obviously come back to some of the Syria news. The West Bank, there isn't much more to say other than the sort of playbook is continuing. You know, the 40 plus thousand Palestinians that have been displaced in massive Israeli raids on the West Bank uh, have seen no indication of their ability to return home again. You know, there's some indications that they'll never be allowed to return to their houses. Again, we're just seeing Gaza 2.0 in the West Bank, and Israel's impunity in Gaza allows them to sort of continue to act this way in the West Bank. So it's getting increasingly horrible there, but that's more or less to be expected given the way that the world has failed to respond to Gaza. And Yemen, a lot is happening where, the US is now resuming Joe Biden's shadow war on Yemen with dozens killed, and this 31 number is quite out of date because this article is from the 16th. And the US has bombed Yemen basically every day for the past week. And Trump is now saying these sort of like, typical, hyperbolic rhetoric about wiping Houthis off the face of the earth. And really, we're just back to the Biden plan of bombing Yemen regularly without really meaningfully achieving anything. There's no indication, for example, that they've actually taken out any high-level Houthi officials or that it's changed the underlying military capacity of the Houthis to be attacking ships or Israel. So they've, after giving the sort of 4-day grace period a couple weeks ago, Yemen said like, we're going to give Israel 4 days to resume humanitarian aid coming back into Gaza before we start blocking ships and attacking them again. And obviously, humanitarian aid still blocked all this time later. So missile attacks onto Israel proper and closing off the Strait of Hormuz for Israeli shipping has once again completely come back into place. And US military strikes haven't really done anything, as far as I can tell, to inhibit that. So we're literally back to exactly the same Biden playbook that we experienced last year with the same results. The big difference here, I think, is mostly that a lot of what's been happening in Yemen seems to be tied to a broader Trump administration plan to have a reckoning with Iran. And it's not super clear to me whether like what the actual ambitions here are for the Trump administration vis-a-vis Iran, because on the one hand, no question, there's a massive ramping up of military preparedness for a direct war with Iran. So like they've, drawn up all these battle plans. They've, put a bunch of the military on high alert. The Pentagon is doing all of these sort of like joint planning exercises and writing out sort of detailed operating procedures for what that war will look like. All of this is happening in the context of what is supposed to be a renewed set of negotiations with Iran, basically to sign a new nuclear treaty, which weirdly, Trump is really keen to have happen. It's something that he's been talking about since the inauguration, despite the fact that, he's the one that ripped up the old nuclear treaty, right, that was signed under Obama. And, in a typical act of Trump pettiness, like I wouldn't be surprised if he was happy with basically an identical nuclear treaty. He just wanted to get rid of it because it was Obama. So it's possible that all of this ramping up of rhetoric and saber rattling is a sort of typical Trump negotiation tactic to try to get this deal signed. It's also possible that talking about the deal and making the deal fail is the excuse he needs to sort of go to war with Iran. That's certainly the term that Israel would prefer. And, Trump and Netanyahu are speaking directly about the Iran nuclear deal next week, I think. So it's, in this Axios article, they specifically go into the ways that like, no, Israel wants that deal to fail. And their hope is that the deal fails. And there's, these camps within the Trump administration, one camp that wants the deal, one camp that really doesn't. So once again, it's sort of this question about like which way that needle is going to go. And huge implications. And obviously, whether it is just a negotiating tactic or a desire for actual war, either way, you're drastically raising the specter of this full-blown regional war, which another thing that I didn't want to be back to talking about, but here we are, where the likelihood of that is now probably as high as it's ever been. So that also feels like a throwback to last year. In Lebanon, we talked last week about how the Israelis were planning to sort of settle things with Lebanon by dealing with the border disputes, but it didn't feel very likely that they would meaningfully resolve the underlying tension because it didn't seem likely that the IDF would actually withdraw from Lebanon. And surprise, surprise, it came out this week that the IDF says that those 5 areas in Lebanon that they refuse to withdraw from in violation of the Lebanon ceasefire, they're staying there. They're staying put. And the defense minister basically said, regardless of what happens with the talks on these border disputes, the IDF is going to stay inside Lebanon. So like, okay, what's the point? Like, okay, you're resolving, some specific things about where the border is drawn, and you're continuing to occupy land that everyone agrees is actually Lebanon. So how effective that's going to be, again, as we said last week, I don't know that it's meaningfully going to um, accomplish that underlying objective of undercutting Hezbollah's argument about why armed resistance against Israel is necessary. Uh, at the same time, the Palestinian Authority led by Mahmoud Abbas, is meeting with the new Lebanese government next week with the expected plan of disarming various Palestinian groups in Lebanon. Once again, the PA is sort of trying to demonstrate to the Israelis and to the US that it is a trusted partner for them and that it can help secure Israel's security ambitions in the region. And once again, it will fail to do so as it did in Jenin. So just to note that like this is part of that long game. In Syria, a lot has happened, including some border clashes with Lebanon that I didn't really add to the slides here, but we can discuss it if folks have questions. The big thing I think that I wanted to touch on with Syria is this International Crisis Group article about how Israel's sort of colonial ambitions in southern Syria might end up actually backfiring spectacularly. I don't agree with a lot of the analysis in this article, if I'm being honest, but I do think that the idea that Israel is overreaching is a real one. And I think we're already starting to see some backlash from that. Like, there are these massive protests in southern Syria now, particularly since Israel resumed the bombing of Gaza, basically saying we don't want any Israeli aggression there or here. Uh, and so, that's something. And, the other piece that the article gets into that I think is important is Israel is, as we've talked about many times on the PSA, Israel is purposely and explicitly trying to keep Syria divided and weak. And one of the aspects of that, in addition to, we talked about this Reuters article from a few weeks ago about how Israel wants all the various foreign powers to stay in Syria, carving it up. The other thing that they want is for the US to keep its sanctions on Syria and to like block trade. Um, and to make sure that no aid gets to Syria. And they said something like the Israeli officials said something about not providing Syria with a free lunch, which is an absolutely insane thing for the country that gets $20 billion every year from the United States to say, but unsurprising in its hubris. So that's more or less where Syria is at right now. I wanted to spend the rest of our limited time talking about what's been happening with the local oppression of Palestine activists, particularly the Mahmoud Khalil case and the sort of things that have spun off from it. So this past week, Mahmoud Khalil, issued his letter from his prison in Louisiana, dictated to a lawyer on the phone. It is beautiful. It's really beautiful. I highly recommend that folks read it. He does a beautiful job of connecting the Palestinian struggle with like, other people who are suffering under sort of similar US repression tactics, including, these people who are sitting um, without rights, like next to him in these prison cells for over a year, right? So folks who under Biden were also being persecuted and deported for basically nothing at all. And then like, sort of goes into the longer, the same framing that Thomas and I talked about right at the top today about how his detention is a testament to the strength of the movement, right? And that like this is just the latest in a long line of student movements that have led the charge against systems of oppression, including Vietnam, including the civil rights movement, including the struggle against apartheid South Africa, and this is the latest one. And they're reacting in the same way that they did for all of those too. So it's important to sort of keep that in context. Also, some good news there that the court has ordered his case to go back to New Jersey. So like that's good. Getting it out of Louisiana is just objectively good. So a good sign for some legal developments there. And then, like, sort of zooming out, looking at the broader picture of what the Mahmoud Khalid stuff means, there are these, two articles that I think are definitely worth giving a look. One, this New Yorker piece that ties what happened to Mahmoud Khalid to the story of the Los Angeles Eight, a really important historical milestone in the oppression of Palestinian and Arab communities in the United States that a lot of folks these days don't really know about. But like, it's just another example of this sort of nothing new under the sun phenomenon where, these students, including permanent residents, were supposed to be deported under Reagan. Like that's how long ago this started. And basically we're engulfed in a 20-year legal battle to fight that deportation for, ostensible, like basically for ostensible ties to communism, right? Because that was the boogeyman back then, as like, Islamists is the boogeyman now. Which was such a flimsy case based on basically nothing at all, that the immigration judge who eventually threw it out, again, 20 years later, well, no, the immigration judge happened earlier. The administration decided to stop trying to pursue it after 20 years. But the immigration judge called it an embarrassment to the rule of law. Like that's how thin the pretext was for holding these people and what it meant about the US attempt to sort of suppress Palestine activism. So again, highly recommend you give that a read. And then also this article in the New York Times by David French, I think does a decent job of showing what we talked about last week, how, the attack on Mahmoud Khalil and the attack on Colombia obviously will never be limited to Mahmoud Khalil or even to the Palestine Solidarity Movement, and they certainly won't be limited to Colombia as an institution. This is a broad attack on the progressive left generally, and this is just the starting point. And anyone who doesn't understand that is like, deluding themselves into thinking that this is more constrained than it actually is. Um, And as that thing starts to spiral out, what we saw, as Thomas mentioned, the detention and potential deportation of Badr Khan Suri, who's an Indian citizen who's teaching at Georgetown on an academic visa. If the Mahmoud Khalil stuff wasn't scary enough, this one is bone-chillingly terrifying because it seems to be that the reason this person is being targeted is that his wife's father once advised Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas official, over a decade ago. Like he has no relationship with the party now, but a long time ago, this man's wife's father had some connection to Hamas, and apparently that's enough to deport him. So the sort of tenuousness of the way that this sort of repression is operating and their willingness to attack people on the flimsiest of pretexts based on, these like hard right Zionist groups um, inflaming and like suggesting certain groups be attacked and deported, which by the way is also happening in the Bay Area, which we could get into, is just, I think, like a really terrifying development and something we should all be paying a lot of attention to. We're also seeing a lot more information about how the United States is sort of expanding its net on how to attack people and how to suppress the Palestine Solidarity Movement, and then like whatever other movements they're going to be going after next, including the use of a series of AI tools and a bunch of like social media things that basically trawl through people's posts to try to find anything that they conceive of as being pro-Hamas, and then that being the justification for deportation or imprisonment. Particularly as it relates to student activism, but it extends well beyond that. I definitely recommend checking out the LAPD one because it goes into like how the sort of repressive government surveillance apparatus is operating in communities very close to ours. It's also, by the way, there's a fascinating, sorry, as a total aside, there's a fascinating article in 404 Media about how the government found the people who attacked Tesla dealerships. I think that's also worth a read because it gives you, again, a sense of how the existing surveillance apparatus actually operates, which is good to know for reasons. In the meantime, I think we're seeing a remarkable backlash against these attacks. And, there's a Financial Times article. Financial Times, not the paragon of the progressive movement, called Je suis Mahmoud Khalil, basically, that goes into in great detail why everyone should be horrified about what happened to Mahmoud Khalil and its implications for the rule of law and freedom of speech. Um, and then there's I thought this really nice article in The Nation about what the way that Trump is treating Jewish Americans with this sort of mob boss offer, right? Like you have to take our protection, otherwise, you're next. And sure enough, right, we're seeing this so-called sweep against anti-Semitism, resulting in serious disciplinary charges, largely against Jewish Americans, right, who are, were in these encampments, who have called for divestment, and these, Jewish members of campuses are being attacked as anti-Semites, which brain breaking. And yeah, this order, right, this new executive order, additional measures to combat anti-Semitism that Trump signed, incidentally, is Executive Order 14188, which is like a famous anti-Semitic dog whistle. It's like I have it here on the ADL website, which, by the way, of course, has said nothing about any of this. That 1488 is like you know, a white supremacist numeric symbol that is very commonly used within the white nationalist movement. So like not as, it beggars belief that this would be a coincidence. And even if it was a coincidence, like they've got nobody around that actually knows enough about real anti-Semitism to be like, maybe do this for the next executive order. Maybe make this one 14189. But no, it's a dog whistle. It's clearly designed to be a dog whistle. Um, and like, we're seeing the sort of hypocrisy that's underlying a lot of these anti-Semitism efforts, uh, including, this, not to be outdone, Israel itself, right, is hosting this big conference on anti-Semitism, and they've invited most of the European far right, like literal Nazis, to this conference to quote unquote um, address anti-Semitism. And this conference, which again is supposed to address anti-Semitism, but is in fact includes a tour of the West Bank, which is again part of the sort of annexationist plan, has resulted in the French and German government officials that were attending the conference to back out. And like when Germany, where like basically anything that you say against Israel has been criminalized, backs out of a conference, like that's kind of when Um, and they backed out before, while Jonathan Greenblatt, the head of the ADL, was still planning on attending. And since I posted this, it turns out that he too has now withdrawn, but only because the former head of the ADL basically put him on blast for attending this conference. And so, these so-called like defenders against anti-Semitism have actually no problem cozying up to the literal far right. But it's like the real plan here is very clear, as well as the way in which they're actually, of course, inflaming real anti-Semitism by doing this and by ignoring, the real true danger against Jewish populations, which absolutely exist here and elsewhere. In response to all of this, worth reflecting a little bit on what the Democrats are and are not doing. You know, Important, I think, for folks to remember, for example, that this idea of revoking visas for so-called Hamas supporters started with the Biden administration. So this is not, in fact, a new thing by Trump. It's just, as we've seen so many times before, Trump taking something that Biden laid the path for and then walking down that path. And at the same time, we have ostensible liberal organizations in the Bay Area, like the JCRC, um, cheerleading the illegal detention of Mahmoud Khalid, and by the way, also calling for AROC to be investigated as a terror organization and shut down. So basically following the exact same playbook that we're seeing from Bitar and other hard right organizations. So very telling, I think, about the real way that these organizations operate and where their actual politics lie in terms of so-called progressive values, but like not when it comes to black and brown people. So to sum up, it does seem that we're back to the full-scale genocide. It's as horrific as it has ever been, and we have to sit with like this like horror and carnage again. I am as off put at the idea of talking about this again as I'm sure you are about hearing about it again and living through this again. The past 3 months of Trump have been bad enough without the thousands of Palestinians being killed by this, horrific settler colonial state. But here we are. There are very few indications, I think, that that's going to change anytime in the short term. But you never know. This uh, negotiations that could lead to a new ceasefire dynamic could be signed. This like U.S. bridge offer might be something that results in longer term negotiations. But I think ultimately the political pressure has to come from the Trump administration. And so, is it possible that this current dynamic becomes so unpalatable to Trump that he sort of changes his position on this? I frankly think it's more possible under Trump than it ever was under Biden, because I don't think Trump has an ideological commitment to Israel. I think he's more susceptible to public pressure than Biden ever was. So there's a there. It's going to be hard, and we're going to face a lot of repression on the way, but it is attainable, and I think that speaks to the need for our movement to sort of take a deep breath and jump back in. We're here, and we gotta, we're in the fight. Meanwhile, regional war is really looming on the horizon. It's not clear whether these are negotiating tactics or whether the Hawks have won out in the administration, but we'll know pretty soon, I think. And then lastly, of course, the attack on Mahmoud Khalil has, as everyone anticipated, now escalated into a broader assault on our movement. So just a reminder that like the way we defend ourselves against that is not by staying silent, it's not by isolating ourselves, it's not by walking away. Colombia as an institution should have learned that lesson where they did literally everything the Trump administration wanted and they still got the crap beat out of them. So a reminder that the way that we do stay safe is by staying united, by calling out hypocrisy from other so-called progressives who won't stand with Black and brown communities that are being targeted, and by continuing the fight, like loudly and together and with arms linked. And that's the thing that keeps us safe, is by being loud, not by being quiet. And yeah, I look forward to being loud with you all at these various events, including a great picket at the Davie Symphony Hall this Sunday, trying to block the Israeli Philharmonic from playing. It's a famously whitewashing institution. And then once again, I just wanted to draw folks' attention to the Iraq calendar and all the things that are happening this weekend. There are very, very many. And I hope to see you at some of those. I will certainly be attending a few. And if you want to see more, just check out the Iraq calendar at bit.ly/Gaza events. If you want text updates, please text PSA to 833-633-0604. And you can always check out the PAL Media Tracker for articles that inform this analysis. You can sign up at palmediatracker.com/signup. And that's the end of it. Thank you all so much.
Sammer, thanks. I didn't actually know about executive order that the EO on anti-Semitism was EO 14188, but it does make me think about what our comrade Sarah Kirshner said at the Palestine conference in Detroit last year, which is that in many respects, Zionism is one of the highest forms of anti-Semitism. And so something to keep in mind, disaggregating those things, that anti-Zionism is its own fascistic kind of ideology. I do also want to just tag on to one additional thing that I don't know if we mentioned it last week, but just this call to action on behalf of Bridget Rochios, who is a nurse, midwife, and practitioner at UCSF. If you've been following us for more than a year, you'll know that Bridget actually was on the PSA in May of last year when we did an emergency PSA on what was happening in Rafah, and was talking about and in taking care of newborns who were vulnerable to what was going on with the attacks on hospitals. And so Bridget has been fired from her job at UCSF for wearing a watermelon pin in solidarity with Palestine. and AROC and many other organizations have called for folks to be in solidarity with her. And so there's this link that you can see on the page, and if we can, well, I think Annie's already dropped it in the chat. We encourage you to help them get past the 6,000 signature mark, which is what they're looking to get, and go beyond that. So please sign that and share out with folks. And yeah, otherwise we will be back next week. And I just want to second, third, and fourth everything that Samara said about how we keep ourselves safe is by being loud and being in unity. And we appreciate everyone coming here and staying connected and informed. And we hope that you will all be out there in the streets this week and at all the events that Samara mentioned in the coming weeks and months ahead. We'll see you soon and take care.